June 2026, the topic is grace, faith, and the deficit. In week 3, I'm looking at the connection between inner and outer abundance. Number 1, because it's mentioned in the lecture. Number 2, because my understanding or my experience with the lectures is the guide says, in effect, you need to understand this before I explain that. And so it goes into some depth on abundance. The topics include abundance, which in terms of inner and outer were covered to some extent in May when we did Pathwork Lecture 191 on inner and outer experience. It's the same process. What is inner will reflect outer. What is outer will reflect inner. So that you can work from the you can work from the outside in or the inside out. But it is the inner reality that ultimately determines what your outer experience will be, whether or not that's the first way you start to understand that or not. Guide mentions in this section benign circles, and I didn't go into that because I spent far more time in the following week, week 4, with spirals of development, which include benign circles. But in terms of creating abundance, I find that key to the lecture on grace and faith. Meaning, if you don't believe in abundance, then your belief system is a bit despairing. It's a bit bleak. And while there can be momentary truth to bleakness and despair, to have a spiritual point of view that there's no hope, that there's only misery, that there's only loss, that there's only poverty, is just soul destroying. For many people, they can't live with that. And we recoil against that misery, just like we would recoil from pain. And the recoil looks like anything else would be better than that. And one of the options we fall into is it's not the universe, it's not the world that's bleak, it's me. And we sacrifice a sense of self-value, self-worth. We refuse to hold on to believe, to develop our divinity because it feels like sacrificing ourselves will save us from spiritual death. To some extent, that's loving. I know that sounds a little backwards, but we don't think this through. This is not a cohesive plan developed by committee. This is how we unconsciously recoil and react to misery by blaming ourselves. And the loving part of that is that the alternative in general terms is to blame somebody else. Now, some people go that route. It's not my fault, it's the world's. The world is responsible for all this misery. I'm not. And yet, once again, some of us can't do that. We just cannot stay in blame. We cannot believe that everybody on the planet is bad, but we can believe that we are bad, that we don't deserve. And we can reinterpret this lesson on inner and outer mirroring to say, I see misery because I have nothing but misery to share. I used that same analysis or understanding of thought patterns to understand why children disparage themselves, why children would rather mommy and daddy be right and they be wrong than to see the handwriting on the wall, the elephant in the room, the obviousness. And this decision is made so early they may not realize it. It's an act of love to try to take on the world's pain rather than believe the world is awful. Now, both are wrong, both are misunderstandings and distortions. I'm simply describing how a sense of unworthiness can be caused by a retreat from lack of understanding of what pain and suffering is about in the world. So that when we talk about creating abundance, we have to deal with why we have chosen to believe in lack of abundance. So think of this simplistically in terms of three camps. The universe is terrible, the world is terrible, or I am terrible. Now, even if there are variations, it's useful to think in terms of broad categories. So if I am terrible, I can't create abundance. I can partake, but I better be careful because somebody will find out I don't deserve and cut me off. It's a state of constant fear. If I'm okay and it's the rest of the world, I have to fight for everything because they will just suck me dry. They will just take everything because they can't produce abundance. And for those of us who can tolerate the thought of a universe filled with despair, who basically think we're living in hell and that's all there is, we would be nihilists. We would be wanting what pleasure we can get because live for today because there will be no tomorrow. So you can see how creating abundance, to work on creating abundance is impossible unless you find the source of why someone doesn't believe in abundance, which I think is the point of the Pathwork lectures. Another part of this section is a lot of advice to the Phoenicia Pathwork community. And I included that for two reasons. Number one, I chose to make this a two-parter. And I did that because the ideas are not easy to grasp. There's a lot in this lecture. 250 towards the end of the lectures, pretty much filled with ideas, very abstract spiritual ideas. I wanted to give people a little bit more time to let that sink in. I wanted to explore these random bits and pieces and give it some space. And I also wanted to include this section on the guide's advice to a community. This is real world advice. There was a real community. So I want to walk through a moment, a little background on what was happening. These words are spiritual texts and they're teaching, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. As the guide started speaking, started in 1956, and there was a climate in the 50s. Post-war climate, nuclear, debates about nuclear destruction, a lot going on in the 50s. And it was a small community, and they were organizing, and they were trying to figure out how to make best use of this resource, these wonderful messages that seemed to come from a deeper source than human knowledge. They were organizing training for helpers. They were trying to figure out who could help the others, like big brothers, big sisters, helping the beginners or the people who were new to the path work. Some people can help more than others, even if, as I was taught as a beginning helper, just stay one half step ahead of your students and they'll be tolerant. They just need a little help. They don't need you to be perfect. So people were training to help others. In the 60s, there was more of this going on. The trainings became more organized. There were more groups. John Parakas joined. He brought in bioenergetics and body-centered therapy work that was embraced by the guide. He did marry Ava, so it was a marriage of interests on the two human beings' part. And in the 1970s, this continued. And at some point, the community felt vigorous enough, large enough, strong enough, well supported enough to purchase land upstate in New York. It was financed by the sale of the apartment that Eva Paracas owned. She sold the apartment and paid for the 100 acres in upstate New York, and they worked to develop a community. And that's the community that is referenced here in this lecture. Now, this lecture is being given in 1978 in April, and the community is fairly vigorous at that point. There are buildings and there are classes and weekend workshops, and there's a structure, there's a hierarchy, there's a governing level of authority, there's training, teaching, helpership levels of authority. It gets pretty complicated. And looking to the future, just less than a year from the time this lecture was given, Eva Paracas would succumb to cancer. Now, in the world of the guide knowing spirit, there was a knowing of her likely destiny. People sometimes ask, how does fate fit into all this? There were different paths, different possibilities, but sometimes there's a probability going on that would be difficult to escape for various reasons. For spiritual reasons, we tend to go down a path. And unless we change or move aside or something shifts dramatically, there's an outcome that is probable. And so the guide was packing a lot into these last lectures. This is, depending on whether you count the Q&As, this is the 8th titled lecture away from the last lecture, Pathfic Lecture 258. So there was a lot going on. And when the guide was giving advice and counsel to the Phoenicia community, it was one of the last times the guide might be able to formally address the Phoenicia community. And he spoke of the topics in this lecture, of moral and ethical bankruptcy, of how that manifests, how it creeps into authority structures, how the deficit is how we build on deficit rather than sound spiritual finances, how faith can be challenged and how to sustain it, and how to reattach, reconnect with the knowing that we are in grace. And that will be mostly deficit and grace, will be mostly the topic for part 2. That's how big this lecture felt to me. So, short summary of week 3, the connection between inner and outer abundance, and a lot of other stuff. I hope you read the lecture, Pathfic Lecture 250, and thanks for listening.